All right, I'm going to try my best at explaining the central nervous system, partially because it's good for retention on my end, and also I guess I'm just doing y'all a favor. It's kind of a 50-50 give here, so I'm going to try my best to explain not the entire theory of what these things are, but as we've taken the quizzes, we've noticed that we don't really need to go in as depth as we thought we did in the beginning. So I'm going to just cover the things that we will probably need to know for the quizzes specifically. So for the central nervous system, starting off the bat structurally, it is surrounded by the meninges, which is a membrane that covers the CNS. And then the main glial cells are going to be the astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglia, ependymal cells, and again, if I mispronounce anything, sucks. Sorry, deal with it. Ependymal cells and radial cells. Now, the central nervous system is actually split up into several parts. So we've got the cerebellar portion, the cerebellar cortex, and then we have also got the cerebral cortex. And remember, cerebellar and cerebral are different. They're very easy to mix up, so don't do that. That'd be a big dumb move. And then obviously we have the meninges, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the thin membrane that covers the central nervous system. And then we actually have the brain and spine, which are pretty significant parts of the CNS. And we're actually going to go into a little bit more depth with the spine as it does have its own, more significant parts. The brain, obviously, it's pretty significant, but I definitely think that it's going to be its own section, so don't worry about that for now. So let's start with the cerebral cortex. And so the cerebral cortex, actually, the cerebellar cortex has three parts. The cerebellar cortex, we're going to start from outermost to innermost. We've got the thick outer molecular layer of the cerebellar cortex, the thin Purkinje cell layer, and then the innermost layer of the cerebellar cortex is going to be the thick inner granular layer. And those are the layers of the cerebellar cortex. Now moving on to the cerebral cortex. This actually has a couple more layers than the cerebellar cortex does. So I'm actually going to move these down to make a little bit more space. Now we're going to, again, same directions. We're going to start from outermost and work our way inside. Now we're going to start off with the molecular outermost layer, which is also called the plexiform. Then we have the external granular layer. And then we have the external pyramidal layer. And then we have the internal granular layer, internal pyramidal layer, As you can see, there's kind of a pattern going, so remember that, use that to memorize it. And then we have, finally, the innermost layer, which is the multiform layer, or the fusiform. So a good way to remember it is that, both the complete outermost and the complete innermost have a prefix form layer. So, you got the molecular and multiform, which is going to be the plexiform and the fusiform. And then there's always going to be 2 externals and 2 internals. And then there's always going to be 2 granulars and 2 pyramidals. So if you can fulfill those prerequisites, you will have all the layers of the cerebral cortex. And that makes it a little easier to memorize it. Now we've got the meninges, which it does get a little more complex, even though there's only 3 layers, because those 3 layers do a couple neat things. So we've got the dura mater, I don't know, I'm not Latin. And then that's going to be the outermost layer. And then we have the arachnoid layer, like the spider. I guess the Greek scientists looked at it and they were like, ooh, spider, let's name it arachnoid. So, thank them for that, I guess. I guess we'll see in anatomy class. Then we've got the innermost layer, which is going to be the pia mater, whatever, innermost. Now, starting with the dura mater, the dura mater is avascular as a characteristic, does not have any blood vessels going through it, and it itself branches out into 2 other layers. So you got the dura mater arachnoid layer and then the pia mater, and then in the dura mater, which is the outermost layer, that itself splits into the outer periostal layer and the inner meningeal layer. Okay, and then now we've got the arachnoid, which actually does several neat things. First of all, it's a thin sheet. I mean, obviously, since it's in the middle, a thin sheet between the dura mater and itself, and it's made of connective tissue. And this thin sheet is actually called the trabeculae. Now, the trabeculae forms the subarachnoid space. So sub means below, and below means arachnoid. So it's the subarachnoid space. And this subarachnoid space actually has a couple functions. So it contains a lot of CSF, which is cerebrospinal fluid, and it has a lot of blood vessels. We're going to abbreviate that as BV. And also, it cushions the central nervous system. So again, the subarachnoid space is what separates it from the pia mater, and then so the dura mater is separated. I know I'm making it a little messy, but just bear with me. Biology is messy. The dura mater is separated specifically from the arachnoid space by the subdural space. So, I mean, it's kind of in the name. Subarachnoid space separates the space below the arachnoid, and the subdural space, separates the dura mater from the arachnoid. We're just going to abbreviate dura mater as DM because I'm lazy. And finally, we've got the pia mater. It's got to save the best for last. So this specifically, mentioned before, these all go together, since they're layer by layer. This is separated from the arachnoid by the subarachnoid space. It seems a little redundant to write these out, even though we've said it multiple times, but it's important to remember their specific spaces because you don't want to get them messed up, and they do actually have functions. So the pia mater takes cerebrospinal fluid and blood from the underlying nerves, since, it's the most inner layer, so it's going to have access to those underlying nerves. And this is all caused by astrocytic processes. So the astrocytes, one of the glial cells of the CNS, is responsible for this process occurring. Now, we are going to get into the brain and spine. So this part gets a little confusing, so just bear with me here. We're going to start off with, obviously, the brain. And so the brain, it's its own beast. So what they're probably going to end up talking about on the quiz in regards to the central nervous system specifically is going to be the differentiation between gray matter and white matter. So the gray matter is going to be made of cell bodies, while the white matter is going to be made of myelinated axons. So the way it's organized in the brain, let me change colors here. In the brain, gray matter and white matter are organized differently than the gray matter and the white matter in the spine. So in the gray matter, in the brain, the gray matter is going to be held on the outside, whereas the white matter is going to be held on the inside. Now, that being said, what do you think the spine is going to be like? Yeah, if you guessed the exact opposite, congratulations, you have a brain. The outside is going to be comprised of white matter and the gray matter is going to make up the inside. Now, why does that occur? We don't have to know until the final. So to be honest with you, I could not care less right now because I honestly hate histo, but here we are. Now, specifically on the spine, there is a little bit of some more interesting stuff that goes on there. And I'm going to write this in green because it's a little bit more extracurricular. But it still might be important because these professors are extremely unpredictable. spine specifically has cerebral nuclei, which is an aggregation or like a giant cluster of cell bodies. And this cerebral nuclei is deep in the brain, and it ends up showing as darker than the surrounding white matter. Okay, so going into the spine structurally, the spine is actually going to be split up into a posterior horn and an anterior horn. Now, this separation of anatomy actually has functions. So the posterior horn is mainly involved in input. So it receives electrical impulses or stimuli, and the anterior horn is typically involved in output or the transmission of stimuli or electrical impulses. And so, that being said, what do you think the posterior horn would be functional for? It would be for sensory processing, because it's getting the inputs of the sensory processes, the stimuli. Whereas since the anterior horn is outputting, it's giving commands out. So what would it give commands to in order to function? It would be giving out motor function commands, because those are usually the output specific impulses that are going to be sent out by the spine. So that being said, the final part of the central nervous system, which is more so a functional part than it is its own structure, but it's so vital that we are going to need to talk about it as a sort of quote-unquote structure, is going to be the blood-brain barrier. Now, the blood-brain barrier, it's like the mouth of the central nervous system, if that's a applicable analogy. It basically separates the cerebrospinal fluid from the blood, and it basically regulates unwanted diffusion. So the endothelial capillaries being very tiny, tiny little blood vessels, they are very tightly packed. They have very little gaps due to all of the cellular processes and all of the diffusion that goes on between the blood-brain barrier. So they have to be closer together. They need to maintain that distance in order to carry out these processes. Now, something that's pretty significant about the blood-brain barrier is that it is not present in the hypothalamus. Oops. I'm going to turn on that real quick. The posterior pituitary gland. Sorry if you can't read that. At least you're following along to my words. And the choroid plexus. Now, just a little bit of a side note. The hypothalamus is pretty significant because it monitors blood components. Basically, it's like the TSA of the blood. So if you're trying to commit any acts of terrorism in the blood, the hypothalamus is not going to let that happen. I'm sorry. It sucks. And the choroid plexus actually does have some specific processes as well. So it is going to be present in the third and fourth ventricles, and as well as the lateral walls of the second ventricle. What it does specifically, that's pretty significant, is that it removes water from the blood, because having a too high of a concentration of that can throw off the osmotic balances, which is no bueno for circulation. And it also gets returned to circulation via the arachnoid villi. And it makes CSF, so that's pretty important too. Now I'm going to draw a bit of a diagram of the blood-brain barrier, which I think is going to be important. Now, I am an artist for portraits. I don't think this is a portrait, so if you're going to make fun of my artwork here, screw you. It's pretty much all I have to say. This is so out of proportion. I'm so sorry. 1 second. Yeah, that's... all right. You do you. That's much better. Not much, but like much better. Okay. So pretend that I had the time to fill all this out and I was that motivated. So just put on your imaginary thinking caps and just pretend like this is all shaded in, because I take that much time because I'm so dedicated to my studies, right? So these projections, like this this triangled shape projection kind of, these are actually going to be the astrocyte foot processes. And these little connections right here, you see how they all connect right at the ends right here on either three sides? These are our good old friend, the tight junctions. We love him. Do we? I don't know. And that's the exterior portion of the blood-brain barrier kind of matrix. If we go interiorly, we actually have this kind of... ooh, I did too much right there. This kind of, let's see here. It's called a capillary lumen. And that takes up the center of this structure. Have we ever had to describe what these do? No, we just have to know they exist for the quizzes at least. So let's get them points. And the spaces in between are actually going to be not spaces, but endothelial cells. And on this capillary lumen endothelial cell matrix, there's actually a projection that comes off. Oops, that's shaded that in a little too aggressively. It's not this aggressive. It's a little bit more understated, but for pictorial purposes, I'm going to make it pretty distinct. This projection off of the capillary lumen endothelial cell matrix is going to be your parasite. And that, my friends, is the blood-brain barrier. All right, and that is going to be the central nervous system. I guess if you know 90% of that, you'll maybe find it on the quiz. Probably won't need to explain it, just, acknowledges its existence, and I'm sure you'll get very high marks.